Hi everyone, my name is Margaret, and welcome to the second episode of the Teenage Thoughts podcast. And today we're going to talk about the single story. And this is a concept that I first heard of in my English class at school. We were learning about this article. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. It's a speech by Adichie, who is an author, and she was talking about her experiences growing up in Africa and then moving to the US for college. And she talked about her experience of living in a stereotype and then experiencing the stereotype later on. And this related to one of the videos I watched on YouTube on comparing IShowSpeed and MrBeast's content on Africa, which is also an overlap of Adichie's background and experiences. And I wanted to use this to talk about my experiences as a Chinese girl because China is now becoming a country where more and more people are realizing that China has so many amazing technology advancements, and more tourists are coming here, foreign tourists are coming here and being like, wow, life is so different here. And so, first, I want to talk about the concept of the single story. So, this is defined by just one lens or one perspective of looking at a situation or a place. So, for example, uh, the stereotype and the story that is usually told about Africa is that it is just a continent of poverty, of war, and of child labor, maybe. And that is the stereotype and the story that comes to many people's minds, including mine sometimes, because I personally I do MUN, and a lot of the issues that I've debated about are about child labor in Africa. So that was what comes to my mind, but of course I know that there is a lot more to that. And that is also kind of the main discussion about MrBeast's and IShowSpeed's content, because both of them are content creators and they're both portraying Africa for views and for content. But MrBeast does so through his philanthropy, through helping the people in Africa who live in poverty to help them build the infrastructure that they need. And IShowSpeed does so through traveling through the entirety of Africa and showing the audience every aspect of it, including the cities and the not so urban places, and interacting with the people there and just showing every aspect of Africa. And so this is the perfect example of showing a single story to a multifaceted story. And in Adichie's speech, she talked about how growing up in Africa, she read books that only featured characters who were blue eyed and had blonde hair. And it was only later in her life that she realized that, oh, girls like her and people like her who have darker skin and who have different colored hair can also be in books and be in works of art. And so that is a new perspective to a stereotype. And then she also talked about this funny story about when she moved to college. Her roommate was asking her, do you know how to use a stove? Which is also a stereotype about African people. And so to me, as a Chinese person, I remember my mom telling me the story of when she moved to the US in the 2000s, and she had this landlord from Taiwan, I think, and the Taiwanese landlord, she probably moved out of China very early on, so she probably wasn't aware of how developed China was back then. And that landlord asked my mom, do you know how to use a facet? And my mom was like, "Oh, yes, I know how to use a facet." And that is also, I guess, an example of when people are so closed up on other people's experiences and stories, like the consequence of it is people feeling like they are not worthy of what they've experienced. And so there was this other time when my mom took me to San Francisco and we were at this mall and we were at the first basement floor at this restaurant, and sitting beside us, coincidentally, is also a lady from Taiwan. And she was like, "Oh, how do you two know that there are restaurants and food stalls in the first basement floor?" And my mom was like, "Oh, because, in most malls, that's how it works. That's also how mainland China works." And uh, the lady was really surprised. She was like, "Oh, wow. Oh, that's how mainland China is now." And so I guess that kind of shows like growing up in mainland China, I know that the world was a little bit not so informed about how the country is maybe a few years back. But now, with so many tourists, I feel like more and more people are starting to know about how China is, and people are coming here and then being like, "Wow, deliveries come in under 30 minutes," or, they're not even like paper menus anymore in restaurants because everyone just scans a QR code and then they order. And that to me, it's a really major example of the single story because I'm living in the story every day, but just it wasn't shown like that. It was shown as Chinese people are still maybe living in the 90s and having all this technology that doesn't even belong to the century, but that is not the case. And so to me, learning about that article that Dichi wrote, she really portrayed this difference really clearly because um, one example that I really related to myself was when she mentioned how Mexican people were portrayed as just those immigrants who fled across the border to Texas. And when she visited Mexico herself, she was just like, "Oh, but those people are just people like anywhere else in the world. They were minding their own business on the streets and living their own lives." And to me, that is also how I feel when people come to China and when they see what China is like. So I think just on the internet nowadays, seeing more and more people enjoy and really in awe of how China is, it makes me really happy too because finally people are seeing more than a single story. They're seeing so many other stories that they feel is worthy of seeing. And I just think that the internet, it could be a place that breaks our perceptions of one place, but it can also make our perceptions and ideas of a place because it just depends on what sources we look at. We can create stories, and maybe we start from a single story. We start from one maybe stereotypical perception of a place, but then we move on from there. We tell more stories and we see and hear more stories that will impact us from within because we know that there is obviously more than one perspective to a thing. And I want to end with a quote from Adichie's speech, and that is, "We will regain a new kind of paradise." And that to me means we will see the world from a different perspective that is a lot closer to reality, but also tells the authentic stories of more people around the world. And that is what matters in this society the most. So, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.